Hi, I'm Sachikara. Welcome to the second video on Ethics Your Responsibilities Part 2, Diversity and Non-Discrimination in the Workplace. In both business ethics and Canadian law, it is widely accepted that it is not permissible for employers to treat some employees worse than others simply because of their gender, race, ethnic origin, religious or political affiliation, or sexual orientation. Any form of discrimination denies the equal worth of human beings. Sexual harassment is one form of discrimination that has received a great deal of attention in the recent years. In a 1989 decision, the Supreme Court of Canada defined sexual harassment and clearly tied it to the fundamental principles of respect for autonomy. The Supreme Court also held that the employer has a responsibility to take appropriate steps to discourage subordinates, particularly those in authority, from engaging in such conduct. Pay equity is another important justice issue. In the public sector, the federal government and a number of provincial governments have enacted pay equity legislation. For example, Ontario's Pay Equity Act applies to the public sector and to private companies with at least 10 employees. Types of discrimination. It is useful to classify different kinds of discriminatory practices. The American philosopher Manuel Velázquez offers a useful model. A helpful framework for analyzing different forms of discrimination can be constructed by distinguishing the extent to which a discriminatory act is intentional and isolated or non-institutionalized, and unintentional and institutionalized. This model provides four different categories of discrimination. The first up is isolated and intentional. A discriminatory act may be part of the isolated, meaning non-institutionalized behavior of a single individual who intentionally and knowingly discriminates out of personal prejudice. You will come across this form of discrimination when you analyze the case, the West Can Conference scenario. The second category is systematic and intentional discrimination. A discriminatory act may be part of the routine behavior of an institutionalized group that intentionally and knowingly discriminates out of the personal prejudices of its member. For example, the Ku Klux Klan is an organization that intentionally institutionalizes discriminatory behavior. Third combination is isolated and unintentional. A discriminatory act may be part of the isolated, non-institutionalized behavior of a single individual who unintentionally and unknowingly adopts the traditional practices and stereotypes of his or her society. For example, the male boss who always assigns taking minutes to female employees and not to male employees. The last category is systematic and unintentional. A discriminatory act may be part of the systematic routine of an organization or group that unintentionally incorporates into its formal institutionalized procedures practices that discriminate against women or minorities. For example, you may have come across the term glass ceilings, which is an invisible barriers that prevent the promotion of women regardless of their qualifications. So all examples taken on the previous slide can be plotted on the discrimination matrix. Ending discrimination. Ending discriminatory practices through such measures as pay equity and removal of glass ceiling is a desirable goal from two perspectives. First, productivity payoffs are likely to result for the organizations that take such steps. And second, it is morally desirable to treat all employees with respect. Positive steps taken in Canada includes employment equity and selective amelioration of the condition of disadvantaged groups. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms allows for affirmative action in Section 15-2. It is worth reading this section in the context of the whole equity clause. Staying on track slide highlights required readings from International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants. Note that for both of these readings, you will need to create a free account in order to access the files. You are not expected to have a detailed knowledge of the material, but you should understand the main points in terms of major threats and general safeguards. This slide also provides details on optional readings. You are expected to have a good understanding of the values and principles underlying statements of ethical principles and rules of conduct of the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. Detailed knowledge of specific rules of conduct is not expected. Core principles and values. Canada's Accounting Association has a combination of principles and rules-based standards. The CPA Ontario Rules of Conduct discusses fundamental principles governing ethical conduct that are derived from 5 fundamental principles of ethics, statements of accepted conduct whose soundness is for the most part self-evident. Professional behavior. Members conduct themselves at all times in a manner which will maintain the good reputation of the profession and its ability to serve the public interest. Integrity and due care. Members perform professional services with integrity and due care. Professional competence. Members maintain their professional skills and competence by keeping informed of and complying with developments in their professional standards. Confidentiality. Members have a duty of confidentiality in respect to information acquired as a result of professional, employment, and business relationships, and they will not disclose to any third party, without proper cause and specific authority, any information, nor will they exploit such information to their personal advantage or the advantage of a third party. And the last one is objectivity. Members do not allow their professional or business judgment to be comprised by bias, conflict of interest, or the undue influence of others. Principles and rules. Knowing the principle behind a rule helps accountants understand the point of the rule. For example, rules forbidding contingency fees for the provision of audit services need to be interpreted against the principle of retaining appropriate objectivity and impartiality. Contingency could well undermine the legitimate interests of stakeholders external to the client, such as creditors and investors. Internationally recognized principles. Because CPA Canada is a member of the International Federation of Accountants, it is obligated to have a code of ethics that is the same as, equivalent to, or more stringent than the International Ethics Standard Board for Accountants Code. Integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior details are indicated on this slide. Protecting against ethical threats. In section 100.12, 5 major threats to the fundamental principles are identified. The first one is self-interest threat. The threat that a financial or other interest will inappropriately influence the professional accountant's judgment or behavior. Self-review threat, the threat that a professional accountant will not appropriately evaluate the results of a previous judgment made on which the accountant will rely when forming a judgment as part of providing a current service. Advocacy threat, the threat that a professional accountant will promote a client's or employer's position to the point that the professional accountant's objectivity is compromised. Familiarity threat, the threat that due to a long or close relationship with a client or employer, a professional accountant will be too sympathetic to their interests or too accepting of their work. And lastly, intimidation threat, the threat that a professional accountant will be deterred from acting objectively because of actual or perceived pressures, including attempts to exercise undue influence over the professional accountants. Protecting against ethical threats. There are 2 kinds of safeguards from such threats. Those created by the profession, legislation, or regulation, and those created in the work environment. Section 100.13. First, education and training requirements, continuing professional development requirements, creating and maintaining professional standards, corporate governance, and professional and/or regulatory monitoring. And second safeguard is independence. The IESBA Independence PowerPoint presentation provides an overview of threats to independence and safeguards against such threats. Independence is critical in the provision of audit services, especially in providing public audits. Independence includes two elements: independence of mind and independence in appearance.